Bay, one of the best beaches in Pembrokeshire and a top destination for visitors to St David's. But over 1,000 years ago, this beach served a very different purpose.
There's a stone-built chapel here, which probably dates to the 12th, 13th or 14th century, which was then ruined by the year 1600. We knew there was going to be graves here because they rode down to the sand, but what's come as quite a surprise is just how complex the site is. There's an awful lot more stratified deposits here than we expected it to be. Very complex site, that's why it's taking so long to excavate and why we're being so careful. At the bottom of the archaeological deposits is a very large stone wall that's probably pre-7th century. So between that and the 13th, 14th century chapel, there's a whole series of graves and other things. So this is St Patrick's Chapel, and the reason why we're doing the excavation is quite clear. There's the sea, there's the site of the chapel, and it's obviously eroding by the sea. And it's been known to be eroding for many decades now, but last year, 2014, following big storms, several graves were exposed in the sand dunes.
You can see just how close St Patrick's Chapel is to the sea, and the site is at considerable risk from coastal erosion. The Welsh Government, through Cadw, provided funding for an initial phase of excavation to retrieve the most at-risk burials. We're back now in 2015 to continue with the excavation to ensure that no further archaeology is at risk from coastal erosion.
Last year, 2014, we dealt with the immediate threat to the site. These are the burials which are being exposed and actually eroded. This year, we're doing a second strip a bit further inland, but still affected by erosion. So the first few days were quite hard work taking off sand and salt which accumulated over the past, I suppose, several hundred years. About a metre or so depth of that, so it's quite hard work to get down to the architectural layers. And so we've got down to those, then we start going more carefully, start to record things in great detail, slowly excavating down through the top layers and just going down and down through time basically. Although we're working mostly at a higher level up there somewhere on the early medieval cemetery, there's actually a lot more happening on this site earlier on than first appears. So we've got a build-up of sand here, very pure wind-blown sand, which is then darker here, which is a soil development. The sand stabilised for perhaps several hundred years, and then at some point there's been a change and sand has accumulated again. And you see here another start layer where vegetation has formed again, a turf line has formed, and then that's then been engulfed by more sand. So between here and here is a considerable time span, but interestingly this particular layer here, it's a dark layer, seems to go right across the whole site underneath everything, and we can date this by radiocarbon dating. There is charcoal in this layer, so we get radiocarbon dates from this. This other layer here is quite interesting because it seems to have developed against one of the buildings we have, which the wall is in the background there. So this actually is part of the early medieval archaeology of the site. This is a soil level which a building was in use behind me, which still predates the early medieval cemetery, but is of interest itself. So we have then got this wind-blown sand which accumulated as the building behind me was slowly falling apart. And you can see again in the background a kiss grave cut down through the wind-blown sand, down, and into these layers here. This is the end of a grave, which is going that way, and we'll excavate that in the near future. So all this wind-blown sand has accumulated. Once the building's gone out of use, graves dug through it. So it's a very complex history going down. What we'd like to do eventually is get down below this level here to get to soil level before sand began to accumulate, which will be in the prehistoric period. We don't know when, but I suspect it's around about 1500, 2000 BC when the soil started to accumulate.
We've been excavating the site for a little more than a week now, and we've already made a significant amount of progress.
But once we get down to the top of the archaeological deposits, we treat everything very carefully. The first thing we do is record everything by drawings, by photographs, written descriptions, and then we start to excavate, slowly removing things very slowly in most cases. As we remove them, to reveal the next layers and record those. So you build up a whole picture of the site, which you can then reconstruct back in the office.
We're looking at quite a complex site because a number of different layers of activity have built up over time. In this trench here, we have a stone structure that's possibly a wall, and that predates the burials that we've excavated so far. The latest feature in the site is the wall of the later medieval chapel and its boundary.
So what we've got here is the west wall of St Patrick's Chapel. This wall was excavated and uncovered in 1924 by Excavations then backfilled. We have no idea when it was built at the moment, but it's probably 13th or 14th century, and it's the latest structure on the site. And what's interesting now, we've actually done some work on it and cleaned up all the loose sand between the stones, is we've got more than one phase of building here. There's quite clear break down here. So from here across there is the earliest part of the wall. That's been added on, and between the two is what's like a block doorway there. So although it's maybe 13th, 14th century, it's been added to at least once and altered. So what we're sitting on here is the earliest built structure of the site. It's made of these massive beach boulders, and it's a wall which runs under everything else on the site. When this wall began to fall apart and sand built up against it, the kiss graves we have on this site were cut through it. And there's one behind me here which is cut right through the wall. We know that some of the graves here that cut through it date to the 7th or 8th century. So clearly the graves post-date not just the wall but also its destruction, perhaps by 1 or 2 centuries. So what I'm sitting on here is what seems to be the entrance through the wall. This is one side of the entrance opening, this is the other one here, massive stones, entrance through here, which at some point the entrance has been blocked by a position of these two stones here and other rubble behind them. I suspect it's going to be an early enclosure wall around an early chapel.
So we have a really good example of a stone-lined kist burial here. Stone-lined kist burials were fairly common during the early medieval period in Wales. And we can see that a considerable amount of care and attention has gone into the placing of these stone side slabs. As a grave, it's actually quite compact, and we can see that from the position of the body and particularly of the arms. And what they'll have done is they'll have cut the grave and then lined the perimeter of the grave with these stone slabs. They'll have then have deposited the body and capped it with a series of fairly large flat stone slabs known as lintels. We've removed the capstones that were overlying the top of the grave, and inside you can see we have an example of a really well preserved human skeleton.
One of the things about this site which is perhaps unexpected, just how well preserved the human bone is. And most of these sites around the west coast of Britain, the human bone doesn't survive at all well. But here, because it's in wind-blown sand, it's very good preservation, which analysis, you get an awful lot of information from the analysis of the bone, which you can't do on sites where the bone's not so well preserved. It really tells us how the people were living, what their diet was, what their age structure was. A huge amount of information we can obtain from this site, which is often not available from other similar sites in the area.
So we've cleaned up much of the sand from inside the grave now. So what we're going to do is we'll go through and we'll carefully remove the various elements of the skeleton. We'll bag those up and we'll take them back to the lab, and then we'll be able to look at the skeleton as a whole to establish the age and sex and perhaps even the stature of the individual.
With partnership funding from the University of Sheffield, we'll be able to do a lot more work. There'll be more work on the bones, bone analysis.
All of the human remains removed from the site during the excavation have now been brought to the osteology laboratory at the University of Sheffield, and the process of recording the remains can begin. This process begins initially by removing all of the bones from the box and laying out each skeleton one by one. The remains are recorded in terms of the presence or absence of different elements, how fragmented the actual skeleton is, how complete it is, and also the degree of erosion that has happened on the surface of the bones. And then the process moves on to then record, for instance, the age and the sex of the individual. The long bones, like this femur, are used for calculating stature. In order to calculate stature, we would take the long bone and it would be measured using an osteometric board, and an estimate of stature is calculated. So for this individual here, their stature measures in at about 152 to 153 centimetres. The process also involves recording any changes to the skeleton that might relate to disease or physical trauma. All of the information about the skeleton is recorded on paper and also visually, so that we have a photographic record as well. And once that's done, it's possible to do another stage of analysis. We can extract collagen from the bone in order to identify the main source of protein that the individual consumed within the last 5 to 10 years of life. So we can also look at the chemical composition of the tooth enamel in order to determine whether or not the individual was local to the region where they were buried. And we can do this because during tooth formation, that is during childhood, oxygen and strontium from food and drink are incorporated into the enamel. But these isotopes give us a geological and a climatic signature. You can say whether these individuals were local to the area around St Patrick's Chapel or not, and if not, we can suggest possible places where they might actually have grown up. Once all of this information is collected and we've got as much information about each skeleton as possible, the human remains are passed on to the National Museum of Wales in Cardiff, and they will curate the collection and they'll be accessible to any other researchers wanting to study the cemetery population from St Patrick's Chapel in the future.
Well, we obtained 4 radiocarbon dates from 4 of the skeletons, and they date from the mid-7th to the early 11th century, which is just what you expect for these sort of kist graves on the west coast of Britain. But they are not the earliest graves on the site. There are some earlier ones which you can just see hints of beginning to appear now. So there will be some earlier skeletons, earlier burials on the site which you need to reveal. It does seem as though the latest use of the cemetery site was suited for children. The small orange peg you see in the section over there was an infant burial just onto the site. Behind me here is another kiss grave of a child. By size of the grave, it's going to be about a 4-year-old, perhaps a 3-year-old, but I suspect as we get further down we'll find more adult graves and more mixed graves. But to say, at the moment, just children we're dealing with, and many of them.
Here we've got a really small kist grave, very well constructed, the side slabs here, and beautifully covered on the top with quite a large number of white quartz pebbles. And then the stone here, we're not actually sure at the moment whether this is the footstone or whether there was a headstone here at one point, or whether this is actually a headstone, and which would be unusual because it would mean that this grave was oriented with the head to the east rather than to the west. And most of the burials on this site have been head to the west. So this is quite likely a footstone, and the headstone, if there was one, lost at some time in the past. It's obviously the grave of a very small individual. Measurements yesterday showed it's only 1 metre long, so it's going to be a young child in there. And it's actually the third grave found on this site since we've been excavating over the 2 years that's been of a very young child and covered with these white quartz pebbles. So at the moment it's looking as if this was a treatment in burial of young individuals that wasn't something that was going on for the adults on the site. These stones occur naturally on all the beaches in Pembrokeshire, so they wouldn't have had to go far, just down onto the beach, spend a little time collecting them. But obviously they did have to take that time. There is that care invested in this grave, and that's why we excavate it very carefully in respect of the fact that they took their time and invested care and attention to it. It begs the question, was this left open? We always think of graves as having been dug, placed, the grave is dug, the stones are put in, the burial is placed in there, the covering is put on and then covered with earth. But this suggests that perhaps this was left visible and that they weren't covered over, because this white quartz is obviously highly visible. It really stands out in the site today, and it would have done in the past when it was fresh.
Okay, so we've got a burial of an infant lying on the back in a supine position. You can see that the arm here, this is the right arm, you've got the humerus, the upper arm here, and then the lower arm, you've got the radius and the ulna. The ribs are clearly defined here, and then running down the centre of those ribs you have, of course, the spine here. And then all of this, up the top area, this belongs to the skull, and then the rest of the skull was actually removed yesterday.
Several adults we've excavated. One very nice one which had a cross-marked stone at the head of the grave, which is very unusual to find. In fact, it's a unique find in it to have a cross-marked stone with a kist grave. And the whole series of other graves of similar date to those.
We have a really good example here of a multiple burial, where we have more than one individual occupying the same grave. It's quite clear from the proximity between the bodies that they were buried at the same time. And often with examples like this, the thinking is that if individuals were buried at the same time, they possibly died either during the same event or within close proximity to each other. And the people that were responsible for the burial chose to put them together in the grave. This burial was actually disturbed by a later burial which cut through the top portion of this grave. The heads of these two individuals are also absent. We can see the position of the hands and the feet quite nicely here. So, for instance, in this individual, you can see that the left leg is overlying the right and the 2 feet are on top of each other down here. This arm, which is lying on top of this individual, actually belonged to the individual next to him. And we can see that the hand is still in its clenched position. This arm belongs to this individual, and we can see here that it was actually flexed at the elbow so that the hand would have been positioned or resting up here on the right clavicle. Now, we don't have much of the spine surviving of this individual, but we can see just small parts of the spine just sticking through the sand here.
But one of the problems we have with this site is the wind-blown sand. It's very easy stuff to dig out, but at the same time it blows back in very quickly. A really good example is just here, where 20 minutes ago we exposed this old ground surface, which is just below the wind-blown sand, and that sand has just come in 20 minutes, half an hour, about 2 or 3 millimetres of sand, which makes life very difficult because it happens all over the site to expose some remains and then they just disappear again and the sand comes over. So you constantly have to battle with trying to record things very quickly as they appear. It's not like a conventional archaeological site where you can trowel over and expose nice big areas of surface, plan them all, and then excavate them all. Here, you have to expose them, try and record them as quickly as possible, and excavate them. Otherwise, you can see here, it's just starting to go again, and as I'm talking, the sand's coming back again. So it's a real problem. We have professional staff here from the Archaeological Trust and from the University of Sheffield, but actually most of the actual excavation is done by local volunteers, and really without their enthusiasm and very hard work, we wouldn't be able to do this excavation.
It's very important to have volunteers so that they can get involved in the project. The project then is able to move forward at a faster speed.
We're not just having to dig holes. We do get to look at the skeletons and go through the whole process. We've learnt over the years that we've been involved with planning and section drawing, so we're actually learning new skills all the time.
It's been a fascinating experience to understand a little more about the process, but reflecting on it, it's wonderful that people will have come here looking for answers to questions, and they're probably going to leave with even more questions, and that itself may be a mark of success.
I mean, there is so much history here and so little written that it in a way makes it much more interesting.
I knew St Patrick's Chapel was here, and this is why I thought really it was very interesting to come along. Last year I couldn't manage to get here, so this year I'm coming.
There's not a lot of artefacts from the site, which is not surprising. With Christian burials you don't normally get artefacts buried with them, but we are getting little bits and pieces which are on the site, not actually in the graves. So we have got a Viking age pin, probably made in Dublin in the 10th, 11th centuries. We've got a little bit of an amber bead, which is probably from the Baltic area. Also a small fragment of a small crucible to melt metal in, perhaps bronze. We've excavated this 2 or 3 metre wide strip here. That side remains unexcavated. That side is the sea side of the site which will be eroded. So here we'll now backfill it, returf the site, try and protect as much as we can from the sea for the future, but it will erode. So the idea is this is now archaeologically sterilised, so the erosion can take place across here until it gets to about here where it's unexcavated, and at some point in the future, perhaps 20, 30, 50 years, someone else can come along and excavate that part of the site which is still intact. I'm hoping it will continue for at least one more year. At the moment we haven't quite achieved what we hoped to this year, simply because the site has been so much more complex than we envisaged. So at the end of this season we'll then backfill the site, returf it over, and hopefully get some more funding for next year.
The study of cemetery sites like this, and having the opportunity to handle the human remains, means that we naturally reflect on who these people were and how they lived. Now, we know from historical sources from the early medieval period that this was a time of considerable movement and contact between communities both within Wales but also between Wales and Ireland and northwest Europe and perhaps even further afield. But those written sources only offer a very narrow perspective on a particular group of society, the elites. By looking at the archaeological evidence, we can actually study the remains of those people that lived in the past, and we can delve a bit further into the lives of all members of the society.